The rain never seemed to stop in our little village, tucked beneath the pines outside Bergen. Most days, the fog clung to the forest floor like breath over a secret, and that's where I first saw him, Grim, a tiny storm of fur and fury crouched behind Torbjørn's shed. His eyes were wild, yellow like firelight, and he hissed at the wind like it had betrayed him. I wasn't looking to rescue anyone. I was just trying to fix the leak in my roof. But something in me cracked when I saw him. Maybe because, in that moment, we both looked a little lost. The forest behind Torbjørn's weathered shed was thick with moss and silence, the kind that blankets everything in slow-moving time. The air hung damp and still, heavy with the scent of wet bark and soil, and the distant call of a raven echoed like an omen through the branches above. That's where I found him again, Grim. He was wedged between a pile of rusting firewood and the rotted-out siding, his small frame shivering but his eyes defiant, pinned on me with a kind of raw, ancient mistrust. His fur was soaked and matted, plastered against his bony spine, but even then, he looked like he'd bite through steel if I got too close. I crouched low, whispering to him like a fool talking to a storm, as if my words could cut through the years that must have taught him humans meant nothing but danger. I didn't have a plan. I hadn't even told Liv I was going back to look for him. All I had was a threadbare towel in one pocket and half a can of sardines in the other. I knew if I reached for him now, he'd tear into my skin without hesitation, but I also knew the freezing nights here were no place for a creature that small and alone. I moved slowly, lowering the food between us, watching as he twitched with suspicion. I remember thinking, this isn't just about saving a kitten. This is about earning the right to even stand in his presence. The second time I approached Grim, he didn't run, but he didn't relax either. His body remained coiled tight like a spring, a ball of damp fur and rage tucked beneath the tangle of wood and wire fencing behind the shed. The sardines were gone when I came back the next morning. The can licked clean and nudged a few inches away, like he'd eaten while keeping one eye fixed on the darkness around him. That was progress, I told myself. Tiny, fragile progress. I started coming by each morning at the same time, always alone, always quiet, never trying to touch him, just sitting nearby with a new offering, boiled chicken, a torn piece of smoked trout, even warmed milk once, though he ignored it with scorn. Each day the forest around us seemed to shift in mood. The rain softened to mist, the birds returned to the trees overhead, and I started to notice the others. 3 more strays, clearly older, maybe kin, or maybe just survivors drawn to the same cold shelter. Misa watched from the high rocks. Rune darted behind bushes with wide, curious eyes, and old Loke sat motionless near the stump like some feline sentry. Liv had begun asking where I disappeared to every morning, and Torbjørn warned me not to get too attached to ghosts. But I couldn't help it. Each animal had its own rhythm, its own story written in scars and distance. Yet it was Grim, the angriest of them all, who held my focus like a thorn under the skin. It was on the 7th morning that the pattern broke. I came earlier than usual, the sky still bruised with pre-dawn gray, and the forest wrapped in fog so thick it blurred the path in front of me. The air carried a sharpness I hadn't felt before, something brittle and alert. As I turned the bend near the shed, I noticed immediately that the sardine tin was untouched, and Grim wasn't in his usual place. Panic surged, not the kind that screams, but the cold kind that clamps down on your lungs and tells you something is off. I called his name softly, though I knew it was foolish. He didn't know his name yet. He barely knew me. Then I saw the trail, small, wet paw prints dragging through the mud, erratic and broken, veering toward the thicket. I followed them with my heart pounding louder than the wind in the trees. Behind the twisted roots of a fallen birch, I found him. He wasn't snarling now. He wasn't even moving. Grim lay on his side, breathing shallowly, one eye half-lidded, a thin line of red trickling down his front leg. Something had gotten to him, another animal, maybe a fox, or even one of the older toms defending territory. The thought that I might have waited one day too long to intervene hit me like a stone. I wrapped him in my jacket without hesitation, ignoring the weak swipe he gave. For the first time, he let me touch him. But it wasn't trust, it was surrender. When I came through the door clutching a half-conscious, bleeding feral kitten inside my jacket, Liv froze mid-step in the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour from rolling out bread dough. She didn't speak, but her eyes locked onto mine and softened in a way that told me she understood more than I'd ever put into words. She cleared a space on the counter with a quiet urgency, spreading out an old fleece blanket and gathering what we had: saline, cotton pads, a dropper, a shallow bowl of warm water. Neither of us were veterinarians, but we'd grown up around farm cats, and sometimes memory does more work than textbooks. Grim whimpered once as I cleaned the wound, more out of confusion than pain, I think. He didn't fight, not yet. It was as if the exhaustion had drowned his fear, leaving only a raw little shell that had no strength left to resist. Liv kept glancing at me, but said nothing until she finally whispered, "You sure this one wants to live?" And the words cut through the silence like a quiet accusation. I didn't know how to answer her. I didn't even know if I'd done the right thing. Torbjørn, when he heard, shook his head and muttered something about nature being cruel for a reason. But that night, Grim slept curled in the basket by the hearth, his chest rising slow, his tail twitching in some distant dream. And though I didn't dare reach for him, I sat beside him, unable to look away. By the second week, Grim was stable, still skittish, still scowling at the world with his ears flat and eyes sharp, but no longer teetering on the edge of life. Liv built him a little corner den beside the hearth, using old blankets and a woven basket lined with fleece, and though he hissed any time a hand came too close, he didn't run anymore. We gave him space, but something was shifting. Rune and Misa had started lingering closer to the house, peering through the kitchen window like curious spirits. Loke even scratched at the back door one foggy morning, demanding food with the tired confidence of a king too old to hunt. Then the phone rang. Our landlord calling from Oslo. He said he'd be visiting the cabin in 2 weeks for a full inspection. We weren't supposed to have animals in the house, not permanently, and Liv's face went pale the moment she hung up. We had a choice to make, and not much time. Do we risk hiding Grim and possibly the others if they kept wandering closer? Or do we try to start finding homes for them? Strays no one had claimed, half wild, and haunted by whatever past they came from. Meanwhile, Torbjørn came by with news of a neighbor's chicken coop being raided, claws and fur left behind, and whispers spreading that the cats we were feeding might be the culprits. It was the kind of trouble that didn't care about good intentions, only consequences. There were nights I lay awake, the soft creak of the wood stove filling the silence while Grim shifted restlessly in his basket, his breathing still rough from the healing wound. I'd watch him from across the room, one hand resting on my chest, the other clenched into the blanket, wondering what exactly I was doing. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was just giving him a chance, to recover, to eat, to trust again. But the truth was more complicated. Each day he stayed, each wary glance that lasted 1 second longer, each time he didn't flinch when I entered the room, pulled me deeper into something I wasn't sure I could untangle from. Liv was practical. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that we couldn't keep him, not for long. We didn't have the space. We didn't have permission. But I could see in her the same hesitation I felt, the same weight in her voice when she'd say, "We'll figure it out tomorrow." And tomorrow kept coming. Grim didn't need us forever, I knew that. But the thought of him being released again, back into the cold, the hunger, the fear, it pressed down on my chest like a truth I wasn't ready to accept. The day Grim disappeared, the world fell out from under me. It had been 3 weeks since I first carried him inside, 3 weeks of slow, reluctant progress, of him learning not to flinch when I sat near, of moments when he let his eyes rest on mine without hostility. And then, without warning, he was gone. I found the back door ajar, barely a crack, but enough. He'd slipped into the fog just before dawn, and with him went all the fragile trust we'd built. I tore through the woods, calling his name like he'd somehow learned to answer to it, my boots sinking into wet earth as I followed paw prints that vanished near the stream. Liv came out hours later, silent but searching with her eyes. I think she saw in my face what I wouldn't say aloud. I was terrified, not just of losing him, but of what it meant if he had left on his own. Did he still see me as a threat, Had I pushed too far or not far enough? That same afternoon, Torbjørn showed up again, this time with a warning. He'd heard neighbors were planning to lay traps. They blamed the cats for the coop raid and the shredded trash bins. It didn't matter that we didn't know if Grim or the others were responsible. The village had made up its mind. Somewhere in the fog, Grim was out there, wounded, wild, and now hunted. And I had no idea how to find him again. For 2 days, the house felt hollow. Even with Misa curling up on the windowsill and Rune appearing in the mornings with wide, expectant eyes, there was a gap, an absence that pulsed in the corners of the room like a wound. I searched every morning, wandering further into the forest than I should have, calling for Grim with a kind of desperate hope that frayed more with every hour. Liv kept the hearth lit and left food out by the shed, but we both knew it wasn't just about luring him back anymore. It was about believing he might still return at all. Then on the third night, as the wind howled against the cabin walls and sleet began to hammer the roof, there was a sound at the back door. Not a scratch, not a cry, just the softest bump, like something small pressing against it with the last ounce of strength it had. I opened it slowly, and there he was, mud-caked, trembling, one eye swollen shut, but still standing. He didn't bolt when he saw me. He didn't hiss. He just stood there in the cold, his body swaying slightly as if caught between two worlds, the one he'd fled, and the one he wasn't sure he belonged in. I scooped him up without hesitation. He was lighter than before, and he smelled of pine and damp soil and fear. But as I held him to my chest, he didn't fight. He only let out the softest, broken sound, something between a sigh and a purr, like a storm beginning to clear. That night, he slept in my lap for the first time, and something shifted inside me, like maybe this wasn't just about rescue anymore. Maybe this was about belonging. Grim's return should have felt like a triumph, but instead it deepened the storm inside the house. The deadline for the landlord's visit was just 5 days away, and our quiet efforts to keep the cats hidden were no longer sustainable. Rune had taken to slipping inside through the back door whenever it was left ajar, leaving muddy paw prints on the floorboards. Misa had started curling up on Liv's bed each night, purring against her chest as if she'd always belonged there. Even Loke, that old warrior, now waited by the porch each morning like he expected a meal and a moment of peace before retreating into the brush. Liv and I started having whispered arguments in the kitchen, never raised voices, but full of tension thick enough to slice through. She said we had to make a decision, fast. We could rehome one or two, maybe convince a friend in the next town to take one in. But keeping them all, especially Grim, who still hissed at strangers and refused to be touched by anyone but me, wasn't realistic. Not without risking everything, the roof over our heads, the fragile calm we'd built. I didn't answer her right away. I just looked over at Grim, who was curled up in his basket beside the hearth, his good eye following every movement I made with a tired kind of watchfulness. He still flinched sometimes when I moved too fast, still wouldn't eat if someone else was in the room. But he stayed close now, closer than he'd ever been. And the question I couldn't escape was this: if I let him go or passed him along to someone who didn't understand the war still raging in him, would I be saving him or betraying him? The morning before the landlord was due to arrive, I stood outside with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hand, staring out into the mist as Misa weaved around my ankles and Rune chirped from the stone wall, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing behind the windows. Liv had packed away the blankets, wiped down the surfaces, and stashed the food bowls under the sink. The house was being reset to its old self, catless, quiet, and forgettable. But the hollowness it left behind was anything but invisible. Grim watched from the windowsill, tense and unreadable. I could feel him weighing every movement, sensing that something had shifted. He hadn't left my side the night before, not once. When I sat on the floor, he pressed his fragile body against my leg, and for the first time, I had felt the full weight of his trust, raw, undeserved, and complete. And now I was supposed to give him up. Not for his safety, but for mine. Liv finally spoke what we'd both been avoiding. We can't lie our way through this, you know that. Her voice was steady, but softer than before. Not angry, not cold, just tired. What happens if they find out? What if he's taken away? I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to find whoever had made the rule that compassion had to be conditional. But all I said was, I don't know, because that was the truth. I didn't know what was right anymore. I just knew that letting Grim go would unmake something inside me. That night, we had a choice to make. Hide them, rehome them, or face whatever came and take the consequences. Each option came with a risk, but keeping Grim, keeping them all, was starting to feel like the only kind of truth I could live with. The landlord arrived just after noon, punctual, polished, and carrying a clipboard tucked under one arm like he was assessing property instead of peering into a life. Liv met him at the front steps, her smile polite, rehearsed, fragile. I stayed inside, crouched near the back room where Grim had tucked himself under the bed. Rune and Misa were already hidden in the attic crawlspace, and Loke had vanished into the woods just before dawn, as if he'd known what was coming. We'd done all we could, and yet as I sat there in the dim light filtering through the curtains, every breath felt like a countdown. Footsteps crossed the porch. Voices passed through the walls, friendly, distant, then growing closer. I heard a door creak, a laugh, the scrape of a chair being moved, then silence. A pause so long it made my skin prickle. When I glanced toward the hall, Grim's eyes met mine from the shadows beneath the bed. He didn't look afraid. He looked steady, as if somehow, in his small, fierce heart, he'd made peace with whatever would come next. And maybe I needed to do the same. The landlord never saw them. Whether by luck or some small grace, he stayed in the main rooms, glanced around, made notes, and left with a handshake and a nod. No questions, no accusations, just the slam of a car door and the crunch of tires over gravel. We'd made it through, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing at a cliff's edge, knowing that just because we hadn't fallen yet didn't mean we weren't still dangling. That night, Grim curled into my lap without being coaxed. His purr was quiet, uneven, like it still didn't come easy. But it was real. And that, in the middle of all the uncertainty, was enough. The following morning was impossibly still. The fog had lifted, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight slipped through the trees in golden shafts, dappling the porch and pooling across the floorboards inside the cabin. It should have felt like an ending, but instead it felt like a beginning I hadn't quite prepared for. The crisis had passed, but the questions hadn't. Liv poured coffee in silence, her gaze lingering on the window where Misa now sat openly, her tail flicking with a calm defiance. Rune had fallen asleep in a patch of sun beside the hearth. Grim lay pressed against my leg, his breathing slow, steady. It was the first time he'd let himself sleep so openly, so close. I think that's when I knew. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't just a rescue or an act of kindness. This was a life being reshaped by quiet choices, one soft moment at a time. I looked at Liv, and before either of us spoke, we knew what the other had decided. We weren't giving them up. Not Grim, not any of them. We didn't know what that would mean. Maybe we'd get caught. Maybe the landlord would return. Maybe we'd have to move, explain, start over somewhere else. But the idea of sending Grim back into the wild felt like betrayal, not love. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to trust, to belong. And we weren't rescuers now. We were his people. Later that day, as the cats wandered through the open cabin like they'd always been part of it, Liv laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. And I stood by the window, watching Grim stretch and yawn like a king waking in his own kingdom, and I thought, maybe we didn't save him. Maybe he saved something in us. It's been months now, and still, every morning feels like a small miracle. Grim greets the day from his perch on the windowsill, no longer flinching at footsteps or hiding from outstretched hands. His scars are still there. Some you can see, some you can only feel when he's pressed against your chest, purring like distant thunder. But he's whole now, in a way I never expected. He isn't tame, not completely. That wild edge remains, sharp as a memory, but it's part of him, and part of what makes the trust he gives so rare, so earned. Misa rules the kitchen. Rune follows Liv like a shadow, and even Loke, who we thought might drift away again, has carved out his place beside the porch, watching over us with quiet dignity. They've become more than companions. They're a part of the rhythm of our lives now, unasked for, unexpected, and absolutely essential. But even now, I wonder what might have happened if Grim hadn't come back that night. If I hadn't listened to that pull in my chest telling me this mattered more than convenience, more than comfort. Rescue isn't always clean, it isn't always successful. Sometimes it's messy and uncertain and full of choices you question even as you make them. But if you've made it this far, maybe you understand. Maybe part of you has felt that same pull. If this story meant something to you, share it, subscribe, and stay with us. There's more to come. Grimm's story isn't over, neither is mine.